next up, we're talking about games, more games. How do you build a good studio? How do you find players? How do you validate early? How do you iterate? How do you scale? We have Fasulo from Starform, Veigar, Bouius from Stoke Games, and Jesse, who's jumping in for, unfortunately, Paul, his CEO, got sick, but Jesse knows exactly what's up inside his company, so I'm sure he can cover it well. So, Veigar, why don't we start with you as we kick things off? You've been in the very early days at Riot, seen a little bit of the new development there. You've been through the R&D ringer at Pocket Gems. You've been on the IP holder side with WB, then launched an on-game, and now you're doing it again with your own startup. One thing to note is that all these companies were either able to raise pretty big Series A's or are monetizing very well. So there's some street cred to what they're having to say. And Veigar, why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey of finding the initial spark?
Finding the initial spark. So I've had a number of different experiences. So Riot, Pocket Gems Mobile, WB, kind of focused on IP. So I think there's a number of different approaches. I think this is also a great panel because I think we're going to get a lot of different perspectives from different people. I'm especially interested in hearing Lou's counterpoint to what I'm going to say. So I'm going to represent probably the Riot perspective the most. And that's very player-focused. So early on, we knew we were going for Dota players, very specific audience. We knew who they were, where they were. I came from the community. I was a huge Dota player. And so it was just talking to them. We had a forum we were very active on. We did weekly play tests. And we would get as many players as we could onto a Ventrilo server after the play test, which I think had a cap of 50 or 100. And our producer, Stephen Snow, would just ask them, hey, what sucked? What's terrible? What do we need to work on? And so we had a pretty good understanding of what they cared about. And that really drove development. But I think we benefited from the clarity of the audience we were going after, which not every game gets to enjoy. So I think when I went to Pocket Gems, I had some culture shock because it was, one, much more mass market. Like, who is the audience? Oh, we don't know. People that show up. And they were much more data-driven, almost to... in my experience, the sacrifice of their gut. I was like, well, what do we believe? It's like, well, I don't know. Well, let's see what the market says. Let's see do people retain? I was like, well, if we don't think they'll retain, should we be putting this forward? And I think they had developed enough experience of being wrong and finding success through grinding that is how they found success, which is a very different approach. And then WB, I'm probably going to spend the least time on because when I joined, they had just gone through a string of what I think they thought was the conservative approach of looking at a game that's working, slapping an IP on it, and then releasing that. And that ended up actually being disastrous because then they enter a market years late with something that's not differentiated and no one cares. So I would classify that as a non-working strategy. So I think if I were to advocate for one, it would be the Riot approach in that you should have a very clear audience that you're making the game for. You should ideally be able to pinpoint a specific person. I've talked to a lot of developers that will say, well, let's say we're making a game for TCG players that also like turn-based tactics.
Trading card games.
Yes. And then they'll run into one that didn't like the game. And they're like, well, not that person, because they also play action games, and we don't care about action games. It's like, well, they played the other two, so we should probably listen to them. And yeah, just talk to your players. I'll let Lou speak to probably the pitfalls of listening too much to your players, and maybe I'll have some follow-ups after.
Lou, let's go to you. Your first company you sold successfully to King. You've been starting it again. You've been in mobile for a long time. How's the funnel differently for you in terms of validating, finding that with players? And how maybe have things changed a little bit with the times?
Okay, so I'm going to address that question. So we actually, we were building our game with players right from the start, and we had several hundred players playing a prototype, and you can put things in front of players much earlier than you feel comfortable with and get a lot of valuable feedback. However, you also have this risk that you're getting like a confirmation bias with the most hardcore players. And that's kind of the thing that we ran into, is that the group of players that stayed and were vocal loved exactly what we're doing. And they were just really in love with it. We had players I think at one point we had like done an analysis of the engagement. And engagement is really what we're looking for. Time, in our case, flying. And we had players that had put 500 plus hours into the beta. So we felt like, yeah, this is really going in the right direction. And when that finally became publicly available, and it was available to players that didn't know the studio, didn't know the genesis of the ideas and the vision, we found that players were bouncing off the game. And it actually caused us to go back and say, how can we make this more accessible? Did we get some false signal from our internal players and some false confidence, ultimately? And we wound up running 2 versions of the game side by side. One that was designed for a broader audience, and one that was designed ultimately kind of through iteration for a smaller audience. And what we did is really alienate our core community. Vocally, they were very, very angry with the changes, but their actions were that they were playing the shit out of the new game. And so seeing 2 concurrent graphs side by side was super validating. I don't really recommend you plan for that kind of thing. It would be better to learn, in other ways faster. But because we were putting stuff in front of players early, we did have the time to iterate, pivot the product, get to a broader audience, ultimately get live and get data from millions of players prior to launching the game. And so I think there's like some place that you can exist happily between Riot and Pocket Gems. And I think that's actually what would be my answer. I think it's knowing your player is really, really key. And when it comes to running tests, like I always tell the team, we can't test everything. So you got to start with your intuition and then figure out if you're wrong. We probably get 50% of our split tests do not align with our intuition. And we kind of think of it like if we're not running tests and learning from players, it's almost like a core KPI. It's like what are the things that we're trying to learn about in terms of player reaction right this minute, and try to have 2 or 3 of those running at all times, knowing that we just will get it wrong a bunch on the way to getting it right. In terms of how mobile's changed, Apple doesn't help you anymore. I mean, that's kind of it in a nutshell. There have always been a ton of games. I think there isn't like a meaningful change in the amount of noise in the market. It's just that, organic, I should say, like, channel sponsored discovery just is gone. And so you really are kind of pushing more into the, how do I connect players and get them to create a narrative together that they're willing to share outside of the game? And that's actually part of the emphasis of all of our design right from the very beginning is, let's bring people together, have them create epic moments that they're willing to share outside the game, and those same epic moments are going to be the things that bind them together. So we want to help players connect, help them start building relationships. We also know that players will come together. Like, part of our core activity when we were building the beta group was, let's get guilds, entire guilds of players from other games to just come over in a big group. And those groups would come over 30, 40 players all at once, and they would stick together and they'd play the game. And because it was private, they wrote up details, they knew the game better than we did. Now we have players that have actually played 28,000 matches of our game. So we also know the gameplay really, really has longevity. And that's one of the things that these like weekend playtests I see a lot of PC game developers doing just doesn't tease out of, that's just not a learning that you can derive from those short-term playtests. And I think coming from mobile, you think about like, we're going to put it into test market, we're going to let it sit there for months and months and months. And that's exposing yourself and your creative vision to real honesty fast. I think that's key.
So on the note of PC and only running these weekend playtests, Jesse, your team has probably shipped well over 25 titles together at this point. You've worked together across like a 7-person co-founding leadership team within bringing the Borderlands billion-dollar IP to life. How do you go about validating for your game at Ruckus today?
Yeah, sure. So it's certainly a continuous process, right? I mean, we're doing user testing in some form as early as, with our first playable demo, right? Even if that's just among the team. However, and we'll continue to do that like throughout the process, right? It'll go from internal tests to the smallest external tests all the way up to like some of these guys we're talking about, potentially 1 million players or more. But I think maybe what I'm hearing here is a bit of a through line, which is we are very much data informed and not data driven, right? I think that's particularly important in a creative industry where, if you need to, effectively it's about aesthetics and preference to some degree, right? So sure, you can take in a lot of information from players, but it's not always the right decision to just, effectively follow that feedback. Sort of wholesale. So we are, for that reason, we're pretty sensitive to the sorts of tests we do as early as we are at Ruckus, right? We've just finished a Series A, which was effectively, that culminated with a demo that's relatively close to a vertical slice. And so, the way we think about it is we're not looking too closely at engagement metrics until we're much closer to a complete product, right? I mean, we've got maybe an hour's worth of gameplay in total, a little more now. We've gone past that demo, but right now we're very much leaning on, our creative instinct, our experience as developers, and we'll shift that towards engagement metrics and sort of more objective assessment as we go. And that's definitely the sort of the learning that our founding group gained through working at a lot of, I should have mentioned, most of us, well, you sort of covered it. I mean, our founding group, we've all worked at larger AAA companies for the most part, where they have entire user research departments and such. And so, certainly we've learned a lot from them about how to sort of move that needle through the development process.
I think the other through line here is what's really interesting. If you're on mobile, you can test super early, very quickly. You probably should. If you have a PvP game, you can also, have 2 teams play against each other. The players are the content. And if you're, session-based co-op, you have a lot of progression. You need to build a lot more before you can actually get meaningful signals. So there's no fully right answer, and you have to think about what is the minimal awesome thing, basically, that you can put in front of players so you actually get that signal. So that's very interesting. That kind of leads into, the elephant in the room these days, fundraising. How do you go about it? How do you make sure you show the right things to investors that they want to see? So you project that the validation steps you see are great. They test your product. You might not have that much monetization yet, if any at all. How did you all pull off your raises ultimately? You want to go? You want to go first? You're the one here who actually sold the company before.
So we launched our game in November of last year. We had been live in a handful of markets and also running a PC closed beta alongside our mobile launch. And then on top of that, running a web store that we were working on, building direct relationships with players. By the time we launched, we had like 500,000 players in an email marketing relationship with the studio. Lots of that we learned along the way. We just said we really want to leverage player relationships with the studio. We know in our past, a bunch of us worked at a prior company, Z2, which we sold to King, that became part of Activision, now is part of Microsoft. We really believed that relationship with players really matters. And we kind of always told this story. If I have a game in a bag and you can't see what it is and it's a Blizzard game, would you pay $50 for it? And we kind of imagine everybody's going to say yes, at least to the old Blizzard. And so we want to build that level of trust with players, and that means continuously kind of understanding the relationship. Building that trust means they're willing to have a relationship with us, is I guess what I mean to say. So going into the raise, we had a lot of ability to connect with players. We had a lot of data We had a lot of engagement data. We showed that players were making this their new hobby. And as we were looking at the data, we actually came up with this, our own internal phrasing of how we're thinking about it. We just want to build players' next new hobby. And that means that we can see clearly where the hours are going to go and how much time players are going to spend in the game, and that ultimately it never ends. And that's kind of one of the key things that we're trying to build toward, is a product that never ends. And that takes time. You hope that it goes viral the minute it comes out, but the reality is that's not a strategy. So you focus on engagement with players and really kind of making them happy. And that's a key part of, I think, what we had, is a lot of data. We had a core thesis when we started. We said there are 1 million players around the globe that will want to collect all the content in this game. And then there's everyone else that's kind of a tourist and will play for a while and that kind of thing. And we said, this is a multi-$100 million game, and it's just a matter of how long does it take us to realize the full potential. And so that's kind of, that thesis has held strong, and we've continually built proof against it.
I think for us, I had like a default starting point of not wanting to work for 4 years on something to then discover it doesn't work. So I was very naturally aligned with VCs from the get-go. Of like, no, I don't want to do that either. So I spent years before pitching just thinking about the space, researching it, getting data, talking to players, joining player communities.
You've also played for thousands of hours in that genre.
Yeah, many, many hours, tens of thousands of matches. So by the time I was pitching, I had a very clear sense of some understanding. But then we had some theses about how we were going to win the space, and that was unclear. So we tailored our roadmap to just getting to a playtest as soon as possible. What's the minimum amount of things we need to build for a player to be excited about what we're doing? And so we were playtesting 5 months in with external players. At 8 months in, we had some of the most hardcore players in our primary audience, and they wanted to invite their friends, and so we let them in, and then the next month they played, and they wanted to invite their friends, and we started giving them friend invites, and we started tracking that, and then we kind of averaged it out, and we realized this implies a K factor, which is a measure of virality of 1.3. Anything above 1 grows virally, so every invite you send out, 1.3 players come in. So we're like, okay, well, that's promising. But then to follow up on the point of talking to players and how you should have a little bit of a cynical view on what they say. So after playtests, I would hang out with players in Discord for hours, just chatting about their questions, talking about where we're going with the game. And that was fine, but once again, I'm not going to trust what they're telling me. Because actually on League of Legends, of all the games I've worked on, League of Legends may have gotten the worst feedback from players, which might sound crazy, but it's because they cared. They cared enough to kind of in a hostile way tell you how the game needs to be better until you fix it. And I've worked on games where people say, oh yeah, this is fine, 4 out of 5, 5 out of 5. And then you invite them back and they don't come back. And it's like, okay, well, I understand what that actually meant. You kind of want the people that are giving you a 3 out of 5 over and over and over again. Because like, okay, you care enough to come back. So not content with just talking to players, I started recording, well, who's coming back month over month? Who's inviting friends? And at the 5-month mark, I looked at, of our first cohort, what percent came back, and it was 53%. I was like, okay, well, it's like a D150 readout, kind of implied. It's not the same apples to apples because it's a PC playtest. It's for a 1.5-hour window, once a month, but also in the middle of the workday, so who really has time for that? But if 53% of those people showed up, that feels like we're on to something. But then even then, this is our primary audience. What if this is some kind of selection skew? So let me find an older demographic. Let me find a younger demographic. Let me find players that don't play these types of games at all. Let me find European players, because this is North America, and maybe they're weird. So just trying to find every possible way I could be wrong, because I don't want to discover that 2 years from now. I want to discover it now. So I think by the time we were raising again, it was pretty clear that we were going after not a theoretical market, but a real market, and that we were also hitting a sweet spot.
Yeah. And so in our case, what we were hearing is that data would be important, all right, around raising our Series A, but we didn't feel like we could both get to the point where we had enough content at high enough fidelity to then also conduct playtests necessary to gather accurate engagement metrics. So we chose instead to just go very hard into proving how quickly we could get a demo to the fidelity level and content completeness required, so that investors would have the confidence that shortly after we raised, we'd be able to pursue engagement metrics and such. And the reality is, we had a number of investors who effectively just said no to us because we didn't have those metrics. It was a big risk, but there were enough that were willing to say yes based on the approach that we took, that it worked for us. And really, it's as simple as that, I think.
So many different exciting ways and paths that can lead you to Rome. How are you thinking about ultimately investing the resources that you do have in the right tools, in the right infrastructure, in the right launch timelines, maybe reserving some marketing budget to ultimately make the best use and increase odds of success?
I guess if the question is how do we allocate resources, for us, we talk a lot about focus, like relentlessly, maybe to the annoyance of my team, because I'm constantly just coming in and asking, do we need to do this? Like, oh, hey, the team has run into a roadblock. And my first reaction is not, hey, let's pour some money on it or let's hire someone. It's actually, do we actually need to do this? I had, as one example, I designed a piece of content that I was very happy with. Players really enjoyed. It was great. My engineering director came to me and he said, hey, actually, this doesn't work. It was like a time dilation thing. This doesn't work in poor network conditions. And we can totally fix it. I know how to do it, but it's going to take like a month. I was like, well, is this piece of content absolutely core to what this game's about? And it's not. And so instead, I decided to redesign it, and it had to work with the same art and kind of fit in the same place in the game for the whole experience to work, which is not easy, but I spent like 3 hours on it, and I came up with a new idea that players actually loved even more. Everyone got super excited about it. And so I made a trade-off of 3 hours of design for 1 month of engineering. And I think there's just a lot of decisions like that you hit along the way where the team's natural response is, well, at my last AAA studio, we did it this way. We had a whole team of 10 people working on this. So we should hire these 9 other people. And I don't know if that's the right solution for small teams. I think there's a lot of creativity you can apply. So I think that would be my go-to for thinking about tooling or tech or staffing or what is absolutely necessary.
Yeah, I think in our case we're pretty fortunate in that our founding group, we've all worked together in some capacity in some way. And we've all worked with similar technology throughout the years. We've been, on Unreal Engine projects for 10 years or more. And so some of the infrastructural decisions we were making were almost a given, right? And that is good for us in that it frees up time to invest into newer technologies, like the way that AI, of course, is affecting the game development process, right? So because and in addition, keeping up with some of the, more cutting-edge rendering technology and things, Lumen, Nanite, the advanced Unreal Engine stuff. So yeah, again, we're fortunate in that we sort of have some space built in to pursue that stuff, and it's worked really well for us. I would say as a group, we're like, we're more on the liberal side of moderate in terms of the way we adopt technology, and so what that looks like for us so far is the adoption of a bunch of AI stuff in the development pipeline specifically versus using that technology as in the sort of the core of the product. And that's worked really well for us, of course, because it's easy to experiment with, and there's generally there's an easy way to fall back to the traditional approaches that those technologies help you improve on. And so for that reason, I mean, for us, it's been pretty straightforward in terms of where to allocate resources around development infrastructure and accelerating development overall.
Our situation's a little more complicated. So big focus for us is really globalizing, figuring out how to effectively market. We have really good data that says, for example, 40% of our opportunity is in Asia Pacific, and we've done a lot of localization. We're doing more sort of culturalization work there, including things like split testing and just really refining the product, the new user experience. And then beyond that, we're going to go to Steam later this year, or probably early next year, and so really kind of growing on the PC platform. And so a big part of our investment is in just improving the quality of experience. We call it first-class citizen. We've been live on the Epic Game Store for about a year, but that started out more as an arbitrage play. So doing a lot of marketing on mobile and then incentivizing them to play the game on PC, give us a bunch of feedback, help us refine that experience even further, and also capture a better rev share than we would have on Steam while we're building the audience and learning about how they're playing cross-platform. Because our game's fully cross-play, cross-platform. We have players literally around the globe playing together on mobile and PC together, and that is a big part of the community building and community experience that we're trying to hit. And so the next stage of that is really scaling globally. And we're not live everywhere either. That's the other piece.
So on that last note, on distribution and reach, all of you kind of have cross-platform potential in your games. What are your decision points on when to take a game into beta, into full launch, how much budget to reserve, to throw behind, maybe even working with a publishing or distribution partner, putting in the engineering resources to make it work in a harsher mobile environment or PC environment? How do you guys think about, points in time in the future to make that decision?
The decision to launch is probably the hardest one. I want to comment on that because, we were in a place where runway was getting shorter and shorter, and game was far short of our hopes and dreams at that time. And I think that is always happens 100% of the time. I've never seen a dev team launch a game that thought was actually perfect. Maybe somebody else has. And so ultimately, we said, okay, these are the things that we cannot live without. And that's what we focused on, always asking the question, what's really important and high impact? It's literally built into our values so we can remind each other all the time, think big and focus for impact. And then, getting a bunch of players in the funnel will get you really focused on what matters.
Yeah, I think related, it's tougher because we're having a lot of these sorts of conversations now, right? And so part of it comes down to, whether it's beta, whether it's early access, the first time you put your game out there, that first impression is so critical. It feels like these days there's players don't give you a lot of leeway. It's got to be really good the first, on first touch. And so conversely, just like Lou was saying, we want to get it out there as soon as possible so that we get that feedback. It focuses our efforts. So maybe the actual answer to your question is, well, just plain, I don't know yet. But it's certainly a very important thing for us to be considering where we're at relatively early, right, versus maybe these other guys.
Yeah, I'll echo it's complicated. One thing I do really miss from mobile, because now we're PC first, is just the ability to soft launch over and over and see how things go and kind of preserve that first impression. I think for PC console, the first impression matters so much, and we have a current zeitgeist of people really relishing being the first to declare a game dead. And so, if you go out there and you miss and people declare you dead, that's really hard to undo.
Don't want to be on Deconstructor of Fun next week.
Yeah, exactly. They're going to really relish that.
Eric's watching us.
I know, yeah. He asked me what I was working on. I was like, don't worry about it. You can trash it 2 years from now.
Smart answer.
So I think that you just need to really watch the market. I think there's an element of understanding the current zeitgeist, the current sentiment. If you have an opportunity to, ride a wave or, somehow enjoy the benefits of some current zeitgeist, I think that's a huge benefit. But you also need to feel ready to launch at that point. So I think you need to be building that confidence all along the way, whether that's soft launching or closed betas or whatever that is, generating some metrics so that when the moment comes, you feel ready to say, okay, we're going to seize on this opportunity. If you don't do that, there's always the fallback of just like very slow growth of we're starting with a very small bubble of a community. They're going to invite their friends. They're going to invite their friends. And if you've really built something, hopefully you don't need to nudge it too much. You can see where it goes. But yeah, in terms of the, how do you allocate marketing dollars, I think you just got to really watch the market and try to seize an opportunity.
I think what we hear throughout, kind of try to find early evangelists even before you're out, even if you're on PC, try to do that, get even full clans from other games in, find that social validation, even if you do it behind closed doors. That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Lou, Veigar, Jesse. Put your hands together for them.